Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 409A, October the 5th, 1979. There's no music because the phonograph needle is broken, but I'm sure you won't mind that too much. The big news of the week, of course, is the visit of the Pope. By the time you get these tapes, he will be back in Rome, but rest assured he'll be traveling again. His next country will be a member of the Trilateral group, is going to Japan. The PR job on this man was perfect. I knew when he was anointed Pope that he would be a media event. He's put in by a very synchronized, brilliant team, and when you saw him against the blue skies and the flowing white capes and the children and the nuns and that smiling face, it's marvelous. It mesmerized the people, and there's no analysis of where he came from or what he can do or what the Catholic Church did in the past. People are yearning for a symbol, and a symbol of peace. And to some people, peace means wiping out the Soviet Union so that we can all peacefully exploit each other without anybody standing in the way. To some, peace means never having to look at any of the minorities, separating them on one side of the fence, or not having labor union strikes and the airplanes and trains going on time. One man's peace is another man's slavery. The men who are behind this Pope, Pope Paul VI, this John Paul II was his protege, also knew the use of media. I have an article from my files going back to 1967, February the 17th, 1967, that Pope Paul VI installed a new transmitter into the Vatican to have the most powerful, large, rotating antenna in the world to strengthen his broadcasts around the globe. This antenna was to be larger. It was surpassed Iran's outlet as the most powerful shortwave tower in the world to diffuse the message of Christ coming out of the Vatican radio. They broadcast 225 hours a week in 33 languages, and that was in 1967. Speaking of radio communications, there just was a convention in Geneva this last week described by the Associated Press, and it said after a 4-day political squabble between the rich and poor nations, Argentina was chosen yesterday as chairman of an international conference to reshape global radio communications for the rest of the century. Roberto Severini, Argentina's Secretary for Communications, will preside over the 10-week World Administrative Radio Conference and will replace the use of the entire radio spectrum from short waves to ultra-high frequencies used for defense transmissions. All this comes at a time when the United States is supposed to be investigating human rights and the missing of 10 to 20,000 people in Argentina. Not to get too far off the Vatican, but just this week also I read that the Argentine government is joining the U.S. Navy in maneuvers. They were suspended for 2 years as a protest against the human rights policy, but their Argentine Navy commander, Armando Lambruscini, decided to take part and will work with the United States and our missile destroyer Dewey. They've been working with them and other Latin American countries for 20 years, and they're back with annual Navy maneuvers with the United States military. I received some wonderful articles from a subscribers to the tape in New York, from the New York Post and the New York News about the Pope and the Vatican that I didn't have. It's wonderful to get these clippings from all over the country because our Western newspapers and even some of the ones from the East don't have these articles. There was one from the New York Daily News last week about a gentleman who works for John Paul II. The tape last week we talked about the finances of the Vatican, and last fall I did that also. This has about a Bishop Paul C. Marcinkus, 57 years old, from Cicero, Illinois. He went to the Vatican in 1947 and began working for the Vatican as a Vatican civil servant. Now, in our chronology, I'll begin to update the years where I left off from 47 to the present, but those were the years where Richard Nixon went into Congress and Gerald Ford went into Congress, and the National Security Council was formed. That's what I call the beginning of the Nazification of America. And a man from Illinois went to the Vatican in 47. The Nazis had gone underground and were retrenching themselves around the world, and he became a bishop In 1969, Pope Paul VI made him a bishop, and he became head of the what they described in the newspaper as a super-secretive Institute for Works of Religion, which is the official name of the Vatican Bank. Those were the important years in 69 to 79 when Michel Sindona, the missing financier who hasn't shown up for trial, was meeting with Pope Paul VI and was to remove a minimum of $45 million from Vatican money for other investment around the world. And this gentleman was head of the Religious Institute, the super-secretive money. It's interesting that the Pope went to the United States and talked about materialism. He was alongside this Paul Marcinkus, who has 3 jobs. He holds down 3 jobs for the Vatican. He's 6'3", 225 pounds, and they call him the gorilla, Il Gorilla, according to the New York Daily News. He's the advance man that sets up the trips. He's the head of the funding and the money and the missing money, and he's the bodyguard for the Pope at the same time. The New York News said that some insiders thought that his role in the Vatican dealings with Michel Sindona in the early 70s might have harmed his career in the church, and Sindona is now missing. They noticed that he was sent for because they want him in jail for Italy for a $225 million fraud, and of course there's the $45 million missing from the bank in the United States. But then the article goes on to say that Marcinkus personally was not burned too badly by all of this financial shenanigans, and that when John Paul II was elected Pope, he not only 17 days later relieved the group in Pennsylvania of their shenanigans and investigations for that $20 or more million, but the gorilla, El Gorilla Marcinkus, was bouncing back as big as ever into the arms of John Paul II, so that the chain of command of 20 or 60 or 90 million dollars of the Vatican money missing, which I'm afraid can go into rightist organizations and Nazi organizations that began in 1945 and 47. This gentleman is not in bad standing with the Pope. You'd think he would be, but he's his bodyguard. Another article about this same gentleman from the New York Post that was sent to me gives a little more biography about him, not only coming from Illinois and going to the Vatican in 1947, but he was the former banker, or diplomat rather, to Brazil from the Vatican and to Canada. And then he lived in La Paz, Bolivia, and Ottawa, Canada. Well, a good section of the Nazis that were given passports by Montini when he was the Secretary of the Vatican went down to Brazil. One of those gentlemen is trying to be extradited now. There was an article in the newspaper again this last week. U.S. lawmakers are trying to get Gustav Franz Wagner out of Brazil. He went down there working for the Volkswagen Corporation, and I've mentioned him several times. He was seen at the birthday party for Adolf Hitler a year ago, April, and they're trying to get him back for trial. This gang from the Vatican helped them get down there, and this gentleman was a diplomat to Brazil. It's also interesting that he worked in Ottawa, Canada, because the Center for the Overthrow of Governments for the past 20 years, according to the Torbett document, and the funding for the assassination teams all over the world, what came from Italy, Rome, Italy, and also up in Montreal, Canada. And this representative for the Vatican was in Brazil, Canada, and La Paz, Bolivia. He, as the El Gorilla, travels with the Pope and is in good standing. And while they have this happy smile and wave at people and kiss these mentally retarded people and go through their little images, there is a story behind the role of the Vatican, fascism, the Spanish Civil War, the ascendancy of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, and if you don't follow it now, the future could be just as bloody. I sincerely believe that. I also reached in my files on the Vatican for March the 20th, 1979. I had an article I hadn't put on the tapes for you. This is just preceding the fall. The trial of Michel Sindona was to take place this last September, but they've been working on that in New York City. The Franklin National Bank collapse in 1974 was to be investigated a long time ago, and for 2 years they were working on the investigation of this case, and there was a judge, Thomas C. Platt, Jr., handling the case. There were 60,000 pages of court transcripts he had gone through, And March of this last year, he resigned from the job. He disqualified himself. The excuse that Judge Thomas Platt gave for not handling the Franklin Bank, the Sedona case, the Franklin National Bank Sedona case, was that at Halloween the year before he'd made a joke either about the Pope or Sedona, and they said that that's why he disqualified himself. This was an expensive disqualification because the Franklin Bank had put 2 years of investigations in, the judge was there, and by delaying and by his stepping down, it has cost the court over $1 million to the lawyers and their clients. But the actual reason that he disqualified himself, it broke, and then he admitted wasn't the Halloween joke at all, but that the son of Judge Thomas C. Platt, Jr., a Cornell law student from Cornell Law School, took a job in a law firm for an accountant office named Ernest & Ernest, who are auditors for the Franklin National Bank. Those are the people that are prosecuting Sedona. Sedona skipped town without going to trial, but the very judge who is to investigate this case caused a 2-year delay, $1 million or more in the delay, and it was put off because he stepped down. His son went to work for the firm that was auditing the Franklin National Bank. I don't know whether this is common or uncommon, but it really got to me or bothered me knowing the background of this Pope, and that was last May the 27th when he named 26 new bishops from 14 nations. He selected a gentleman from Philadelphia, John O'Connor, and this gentleman was a rear admiral in the Navy, and he was to become the Navy's chief chaplain. So Mr. O'Connor was named a bishop in the Catholic Church, and now he will assist Cardinal Terence Cook, according to the Washington Post, in New York as a Roman Catholic military vicar of the U.S. Armed Forces. It seems a little funny that when this bishop, when they gather to elect the new pope or have a chain of command in the Vatican, that one of the bishops there is an admiral in the U.S. Navy. That I don't know how you feel about that, or how common it is, but it really bothers me. One more story about the Vatican before we get on to other stories. Again, last March, and I have a large file on the Vatican. I haven't used them all, but the missing money stories are always interesting. And last March 29th, 1979, in the Washington Post, was a story about NBC expense money missing. Senator Church's committee came out with a rough figure that 400 people in the news media are associated with the Central Intelligence Agency, but we couldn't get their names, obviously, or we would know that all the reporters and news writers giving us our information probably are from the CIA. But this article was about NBC probing the fact that they had $1 million missing in 10 years, and some of it was chalked up to expense accounts. And they cited one particular person, John Cox, 34 years old, a former employee of NBC's Washington Bureau. Cox went to the investiture of John Paul II in Rome with a briefcase of $38,000 in cash, and the cash was missing and never recovered. That was just part of the known $1 million fund. Well, if the NBC has agents or could have agents, they could chalk up as stolen money or missing money or account money. But I'm sure to get the media event that was achieved with this Pope, wherever he went, that there's a lot of money and a lot of planning, getting a lot of people out on the streets, and this missing money always interests me because how much of it is used in Rome if there was hanky-panky with the first Pope, if newspaper stories were covered, if stories were killed, what does it cost to keep the lid on some of the things that happened, say, to John Paul I? I don't know, but NBC alone, admittedly, lost $38,000 in cash when one of their radio TV men was covering the Pope's investiture, and why would he go with $38,000 in cash? The one thing that I know for sure is that Nazism never died. There's no such thing as a neo-Nazi, and there is a connecting link going all the way from point A to point whatever it takes to control the world, and it moves very swiftly. The New York Times had an article Wednesday, September 26th, Paris Murder Arouses Fear of Right-Wing Violence. It's by Flora Lewis. In Paris, it said there was a street murder of a 35-year-old leftist rider last week, and anti-Semitic groups were involved. His name is Pierre Goldman, and 2 days after Pierre Goldman was shot down by 3 unidentified youth, a bomb damaged an apartment in another part of Paris. But there was graffiti on the wall of this where a man lived, and it said, "We're killing Legend, Legand. The insult will find retribution, 24-275, signed SS." I'm sure meaning the Hitler SS troops. Jean Legend, according to this article, was part of the French resistance movement, and when Otto Skorzeny, the former SS colonel, was leaving Paris on a television station, this outrageous Nazi war criminal was leaving. It was 1975, and he was interviewed about a book he wrote about his war activities. This Jean Legend cracked a whip at Skorzeny as he was leaving the radio TV station, the Paris television station. And this is 1979, 4 years later, with a note, and they bombed his home. The article in the New York Times says there's an emergence of anti-Semitism, of Nazis. It's linked to the Goldman murder, and the police, again, like Nazi Germany. This goes into that book, Seymour Millman's book that I quote over and over again, the work of the 400 political assassinations in Germany and the justice system where the innocent are locked up and the guilty are free. The Paris police are not finding those people who are killing the Jews or the resistance movement, the people that are opposing Hitler. There was an article pointing out the fact and leaving a note that the police will not catch him because they work for him. An anonymous phone caller said that Mr. Goldman had been executed by a group called Honor to the Police, and they called note that the police there are not catching the people and that they have no intention of getting them, and that they are soft on these assassins who are killing the left and the Jews in Paris. The police are doing the same thing in Long Island and Connecticut with these crosses burning and homes bombed and so forth. Nobody is caught and nobody is tried. Anti-Semitism is the concern in Paris again. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir are concerned about the murder of Mr. Goldman, and there is a growing Nazi movement and a link to the police departments, and the police are very overt in letting these terrorists escape and go. Another case took place in Chile this last week where the United States government pulled away their embassy because the people involved with the Tellier murder and the terrorists were released from the Chilean jails. They will not extradite those people to the United States for trial, and they're releasing the terrorists who are doing the killings there from the jail. The police officials are doing it in Chile, and Chile is now a Nazi country. The New York Times, just this Sunday the 16th, 1979, in the magazine section, has an article reviving the myths of Holy Russia. Incidentally, if you get Time magazine or Life, you see the inserts of the beauty and glories of the Tsar and the Tsar's family in this angelic setting, selling vodka or whatever, going back. And this article has, in the New York Times, has a lot to say about anti-Semitism, about the Russians coming to the United States, Solzhenitsyn, the meeting in San Francisco that this author went to, where a teacher from a nearby language school, I'm sure that's this Army Presidio school down here in Monterey, that is full of white Russians and Nazis, not neo-Nazis. And the New York Times article goes into the meeting of the Russians that are coming to this country and how they want to get back into Russia and how Russia inside is moving to the right. And they keep referring to the revolution in 1917 and what went wrong. And they blame the Jews, and the discussion is the Jews and the glorification of the Tsar and the days of the Tsar. And again, this virulent anti-Semitism coming out of the Russians that have been brought here by Mr. Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger to the United States, as well as Henry Kissinger overthrowing Allende's government and putting in the Nazis in Chile. One of the biggest cover stories, as big as mind control and atomic bomb, is the changing of people's names and making them appear as Jews to escalate the Nazi phenomena. Well, you can read the New York Times article, and it compares the discussion of the blaming of the revolution to the days in France when Pétain was blaming the Jews for what went on in France at the time of the German occupation, the Jew is the scapegoat because the Jew had such a hard life with the pogroms, and the Soviet government was put in partly by a lot of Jewish strategists. Karl Marx was one of them, who believed that they had to overthrow the Tsar and the monarchy in order for people to get education and freedom to employ themselves and health plans and so forth, and freedom from terror from the pogroms that took place under the Tsar. Well, these people are meeting all over the United States in pockets, planning to get the Russia back they want, not talking about the oil and the minerals in Siberia and the wealth that will be theirs if they can take it back. So the New York Times is worrying about the resurgent Nazis in Paris and in France. The New York Times, in another section, is printing what is going on in the United States with the plans of these Russians and their intent if they take over again. That's why I say don't take the Pope lightly, because his antenna and links go directly into all these areas. I received an article from the Oregonian. It was copied from the Washington Star. If you get the Washington Star, August 28, 1978, and it has to do with spying in America and in Europe. The article says that the new Carter plan for spying, the Intelligence Charter Bill, S-2525, that was offered last year, is being revised and will surface very shortly. It has to do with intelligence and surveillance of Americans at home and abroad. And the frightening thing about this new Carter plan is that Americans can be spied upon, not if they're suspected of being criminals, not if they have ties to espionage, but if they have something in their mind that the government wants, it gives them the right to take it from them, from their head or their mind, or to bug them. The new charter that Carter is putting in for intelligence, the counter-proposal to the original one set up last year, would allow Americans to be bugged and be on surveillance to obtain information. Now that is something awfully new, to target just the information. The intelligence officials insist, this article says, that they can target information and not the person. The fact that the information is in the possession of a person is almost incidental. And this is a direct quotation from this plan. The whole point is to get the information. You don't care who has it. The person is not being investigated. We don't focus on the individual, only the nature of his information. For example, if somebody knows about an oil deal in the Middle East, you don't care if that person is a spy or a suspect or organized crime or whatever. You want to know what is happening to the oil. He can be targeted for surveillance. If you want to know about gold or the money changing in the world, if you have information, you can be targeted for surveillance. The whole purpose is to survey you if you know something and they want to know it, and it's for national interest, not necessarily national security. There will be a foreign intelligence, 7-member foreign intelligence surveillance court, and the intelligence community can go to them and say, we think this person has information and we want to know it. Now, what if they want to know who was behind the assassinations or what Mae Brussell is doing, and will it endanger our national security if certain information is revealed? It would be legal to target me or anybody else for surveillance if they want to know what I know. Now, that saves them a lot of figuring out and a lot of expense, because individual citizens can put things together and then they can take it. There were scientists in Carmel Valley that came up with a certain radio system, and the government put a stop that they couldn't use this particular system because it would interfere with what they were doing, and the men had worked very hard on that. This is like reading your minds, electronically taking hold of what you are doing and interpreting whether or not other people need to know it, if it's for their security. I'm going to read you what the administration officials said last week about this charter for intrusion into our positive lives. The officials said, in quotes, intrusive surveillance techniques could be used on Americans not suspected of criminal activity. Intelligence officials said they're interested in obtaining positive foreign intelligence information about the capabilities or the intentions or activities or organizations or persons, including economic information that would help this country. Intelligence officials insist that they can target the information, not the person. The fact that such information is in the possession of a person is almost incidental. The whole point is to get the information, said one government lawyer. You don't care who has it. The person is not being investigated. We don't focus on the individual, but on the information and the nature of the information. Members of the Senate said that what they call positive foreign intelligence is the knottiest problem in the Charter. The question is, how far can U.S. intelligence agencies extract information from an American who has not done anything wrong, has not violated any law, is not working for a foreign power, and yet has possessed information that the U.S. government desperately wants? Now, the Senate has claimed that mid-September, past September, was the date for introducing this charter proposal to Congress, but that the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty might put it off. But keep your eyes open for this charter and articles, and send me from wherever you are whatever you have on this subject, and we'll ponder it a little bit. The FCC is also going through, the Federal Communications Commission is going through a change, and they're changing a lot of the rules on radio. And I think about the Argentine position with the shortwave radios and the Vatican radio towers, and we know what the media does in this country and around the world. They want to change the requirements of radio stations. They used to have a minimum amount of local news that they had to carry for the various people, and there's a suggestion of letting that go and letting the radio stations just decide what they want. They want to eliminate all limits on the amount of commercials that can be on the radio, and no limits on the amount of news or public affairs broadcasts that must be provided by radio stations. When I was on KLRB for 7 years, it was part of the public affairs requirement that they have a certain amount of news time, and I was glad to do that. And they also carry local and national news on that station, the FM stations. But if they eliminate the responsibility for local news and use just canned news, it saves hiring newscasters, and people don't come in, and then you get this blanket coverage all over the world with just one or two or three voices telling you what's going on in the world. Also, if the limitation is off on commercials and news, politicians with the most money can buy the most time, and there's also a suggestion of doing away with any limits on equal time, which of course puts the poor people and their candidates and representatives down to nil. There will be no chance of really getting on, because the large amount of money that's given to campaigns is saved for the last few days, and those people are put on television, and then when they go to the polls to vote, it's those faces that they vote for and the voices that they hear. So the changing, or what they call the easing of regulation of radio, will be a big difference. Also, there's a radio station here, a classical musical radio station, that was bought over by a church group out of Cincinnati. There's a lot of Christian stations coming up that are totally religious, and this was blocked by a lawsuit in several parties that you can't buy a station and totally change it to another person, but you have to keep a format similar to the one they had, because this was the only classical music station on the entire peninsula. That was blocked temporarily, but if you ease all regulations of radio, you could have every radio station religious and every commercial, churches and government interests, and whoever has the money will push it. And right now the FCC, in what they call easing the regulation of radio, is making it right for one more step towards fascism. Each week I seem to be talking about stepping stones or the noose getting tighter or tighter, but that's my interpretation, and that's what I see, and that's what I think is the result of all these political assassinations that I've seen, is to make another war, get us into that Third World War, and control people. And I see control at every angle. I wish our news was happier. On the other side of this tape, we'll go into more control, but that's what I see in the news, and that's what I share with you. And if it's dismal and if it gets too bad, that's just the way I see it, and if there's a break, I'd also share that with you. This is side 2, tape 409, October the 5th, 1979, and it's Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Last week I talked about the government with their aerosol cans spraying out of San Francisco and also down in the Bahamas and in Miami, New York, 5 different areas that they admitted that they were testing, spraying these to get the reaction of people. It caused pneumonia and some deaths. Now they're admitting deaths, goodness knows how many. But the U.S. government, using this kind of biological warfare against their people, receives absolutely no attention other than being in the newspaper. I listen to the talk shows on the radio, 24-hour talk, KGO on the West Coast. Very few people even talk about it. There was an editorial in the San Francisco Examiner last week. If the Soviet Union used aerosol sprays to cause pneumonia in the San Francisco Bay, it would be an act of war. We can't blame the news media for not giving us information. Often we say they hold things back from us. But the outside editorial of the pneumonia clouds over the Bay Area, as I say, they were in Panama City, Florida, San Francisco, New York, Key West. No reaction to those aerosol sprays. I believe that they were the grandfather of Legionnaire's disease I mentioned on the tape last week. But in general, the reaction of people is very, very quiet to this kind of activity of your own government. There was another article. This is a UPI story, so I'm not getting it alone. It has to go over all the wire services. U.S. tested hallucinogens in Utah drug clouds in 1964. Now, this one article on the Bay Area being sprayed with bacteria was 1949 to 1969. And in that time slot, in 1964, right after the Kennedy assassination and just prior to, a few years later, Robert Kennedy would be killed and Martin Luther King would be killed, the United States had drug clouds. There were hallucinogens. Not only were people given LSD on the street with poisons in it, but over Utah they wanted to determine if soldiers would be delirious or incapacitated if they had these clouds. So clouds were given hallucinogens in them, put into them, and spread over the Utah area. It is really ironic that Utah, the home of the Mormon religion, it's a great percentage of the people are Mormons there, and they don't smoke and they don't drink, and they stockpile food for a year in case of a catastrophe, and they have these vaults and banks with their and our files in them. They're so particular about themselves, but their area was the home of the missile and satellite development. It's been the testing ground of animal mutilations and sheep. I may go into that a little bit on this tape with you. But the important thing, again, in this whole time period was getting people's minds. As I mentioned last week, these pneumonia experiments and these bacteria experiments were done, tests to herd people off into pens to take them away. And here is a way to get delirium and affect their minds with hallucinogens put into the clouds over your sky, the area you breathe, to affect your mind, and your government is doing that. Doesn't that bother you a little bit? And if it bothers you and me, how far does the reaction go to other people to even respond to when they see something like this in the newspaper? I was cleaning out closets a few weeks ago and repiling articles that I haven't had time to really cross-file in many years. And I have a gold mine of old articles that really belong in a library and catalog for all of you to share. And I pulled out an article from 1967. This is the time period they were testing, from 49 to 69 and then up to 75, and they're still testing. This article is from February 21st, 1967, on Army stockpiles and equipment, an Associated Press story, preparation for riots in the United States. The Army is stockpiling riot equipment control. It's strategically located in depots across the country. It is ready to airlift in any civil disorder. The National Guard's training is actually, they said, a very effective, mostly lily-white guard. It's centered in a national police force that could be dangerous, this article said, and it could be part of a regular Army unit, this riot control. In quotes, the Army is stockpiling special equipment in a half dozen or so depots They refuse to say the exact number. They've developed a plan for providing very rapidly any additional communications equipment required by the states. They have searchlights, riot control, M79 grenade launchers. Training has been broadened. There are week-long courses in riot control at Fort Gordon, Georgia. Now, that was the home of the Garden Plot, and the people working with that riot control were Ronald Reagan in California. In fact, at one of the meetings, he said if anybody knew we were doing this, they'd think I was taking over the country, something to that effect. This is going back to 1967. The Army established at the Pentagon last December a 13-member special civil disturbance group, the Special Office for Military Support to Civil Authority, that has 227 full-time staffers throughout the nation, and they plan to go into select routes into urban slums, and they have places where buildings the troops would be housed, and they use those buildings. They have the maps and the men. Remember at the time of Watergate when James McCord was part of that secret 16-man special civil disturbance group linked to communications and the liaison of the CIA to the military around the country. That was set up in 1967, and McCord never went to jail, and his links to the Pentagon and the CIA were never developed when he was caught at the Watergate Hotel bugging the Democratic Party and altering our elections to make sure that Richard Nixon, the man who had worked with Nikolai Malaksa and the Nazis and the Iron Guard and the Odessa to make sure that he got in. They had to do everything to manipulate the Democrats and bug them and survey them. As I say, nothing is new. There's a continuous route that they take, and I thought you might be interested in this article that was written 12 years ago. Last week I mentioned about the bacteria and the aerosol cans and the pneumonia over the city in 1949 to 1969. And as I put on the printed sheet with the tape, I said it was the grandfather of the Legionnaire's disease and swine flu. There was an interesting article a week earlier that I didn't have time on the tape called Legionnaire's Disease Germ Linked with Other Illnesses. And the important thing about the swine flu at Fort Dix and the Legionnaire disease and the aerosol cans and pneumonia and the sprays in the clouds to control us, to pick us up in large groups, to herd us into pens, those are the words used by the Army, or to cause our dementia or a mind disarrangement. The important thing about that is, again, that the headquarters for the disease control are down at the U.S. Center for Disease Control in Georgia. I did a radio show that was outrageous. They were furious on why it was a Georgia radio station, the ABC or NBC station, on why they should break up the government being in disease and medical control, and the very people that planned the riot control in Georgia built their disease control, and these disease center controls are the medicine depots and the repository for information, and they also can be like the Rockefeller Medical Institute or the Howard Hughes Medical Institute or the Daniel Ludwig Funds for Cancer located in Switzerland. They can also be the seeds of genocide. This article in the Monterey Herald says Legionnaire's disease germ linked with other illnesses. Now, wouldn't you know that? And here's the gist of the article, which is really outrageous. They're calling it, it's got a new name now, it's called Pontiac disease because it broke out originally Pontiac fever. I think it's called Potomac disease. They just spelled it wrong. This article says that federal health investigators are certain that the unusual microbe that caused Legionnaire's disease also causes dramatically different diseases called Pontiac fever. The same bacteria may be involved in other diseases, lung abscess, inflammation of the lining of the heart, which causes 800,000 annual cases of pneumonia that cannot be attributed to any other virus or bacteria. Now that's important because what they sprayed were these bacteria, these pneumonia clouds, and the intent to test them on people to round them up for military purposes. And now they're admitting that the Legionnaire disease has the same symptoms as what they were using in 1949 and 1969 exactly, that there is no such disease, but it's linked to those aerosol spray cans. Dr. David Fraser, chief of the Special Pathogens Branch of the U.S. Center for Disease Control, said it is clear that Legionnaire, the official name for Legionnaire's disease, is a relatively common disease. Anywhere from 7,000 to 36,000 cases occur each year in the United States. They've been detected in 40 states and foreign countries. Were these let loose from their test tubes, from these aerosol cans, all this massive spraying that has been going on? They went on to say that in 1976, the Legionnaire's disease broke out in Philadelphia, and it was unclear how the same bacteria can cause two diseases that differ so much in their symptoms and prognosis as they found in the hotel in Philadelphia. It becomes clear when you understand the symptoms in Philadelphia and the symptoms in San Francisco, and goodness knows elsewhere. There's just because of a lawsuit of a man dying from this in San Francisco that this was surfacing. But they came to the conclusion that this new disease is called Pontiac fever, and that Legionnaire's disease is linked to Pontiac fever, and that the two have, in their symptoms and prognosis, they differ, but they're giving them these names and linking them. Without specific treatment, 20% of the victims die, and they describe the high fever, the chest pains, the pneumonia that goes with it. Pontiac fever produces the same symptoms, some of the same symptoms as Legionnaire, but they appear 1 or 2 days after exposure to the bacterium. Another difference between Pontiac fever and Legionnaire's disease shows that only 1 out of every 100 persons exposed develops it. Studies of Pontiac fever show that 95 out of 100 persons exposed get the disease. Now here is the interesting part. Pontiac fever is named because it was identified in a group of workers at the Oakland County Medical Department in Pontiac, Michigan. The workers became ill in 1968. This is when the testing was still going on, but the disease wasn't identified until 9 years later, when Fraser, the head of our medical unit down in Georgia, discovered, along with his associates at the Georgia Testing Center, that they tested the blood from the samples and discovered what they now call Pontiac fever, which has the same symptoms as Legionnaire's disease. Now, I believe that the Legionnaire's disease and the Pontiac fever and all this hanky-panky and this pneumonia and the specific symptoms of the fever, the chest pains, the headaches, the abdominal pains, the shortness of breath, go back to the testing of the government in these various cities that they've singled out. Another interesting article in the New York Times this last week: Philadelphia hotel is back in business. That poor Bellevue Stratford Hotel went broke and closed when they had the Legionnaire's disease. It was 1967. 29 people died and 100 more were sick at the time of the convention, and it went broke. But it's now back in business, and it's run by Richard L. Swig, SWIG, president of the Fairmont Hotel in California. If you don't know Ben Swig, he is Mr. California. He is very political. He gives millions of dollars to political campaigns in this country. And it's interesting, if the government caused the Legionnaire's disease and caused this hotel to go bankrupt, that one of their granddaddies and multimillionaire benefactors becomes the recipient of this huge hotel. It was built originally by a man who managed the former president of the Waldorf Astoria in New York. It was built in 1904. It's a landmark in Philadelphia. They'll polish it up, make millions of dollars, and turn it into a jewel. It was closed, and the original owners lost money because 26 people died, as I say, and 100 people were sick. Ben Swig bought a lot of money, put a lot of money, into the Monterey Peninsula, in our resort area down, was about 6 or 10 miles from the house, called Cannery Row. He bought it with a man named Mr. Myers, who was the chief general at Fort Ord, which is another 6 miles from Cannery Row. And Cannery Row is just 2 blocks from the language school, the spy school, on the Monterey Peninsula. It's right down below it, 2 blocks on down. And Ben Swig had bought a lot of property there with a general from Fort Ord who retired. At one time, during this riot control in that era, they were apprehended for stockpiling weapons in property down at Cannery Row. It was a very wild political area, and it sure still is. but they were apprehended at that time, a general and Mr. Swig, for having weapons there on the property. Nothing, of course, ever came of that. So Ben Swig is connected in some ways to the former head of Fort Ord out here, and he owns totally the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, which is one of the famous landmarks, and his son is now managing the hotel that went defunct, and they were the recipients of when the Legionnaire's disease closed it out. I'm not saying much. You can come to your own conclusions of what I think transpires. Everybody who's in on it gains except the people. If I were asked what is one of the priorities that you have with your research or would hope to get done, I would say two priorities. One, publish a list of all the Nazis, the 642 Nazis that came over here on Project Paperclip, put their name, their German name or their American name if they changed it, where they work now, what defense industries, what positions they hold in universities, their salaries at this point, and what cities they live in, and pin the map of the United States of where 640 top rocket scientists and educators from Nazi Germany came to this country in 1945 to 47, what they profited and what part they've had in getting us to the brink of World War III. And then the next goal would be to open up and then close all government involvement in medicine. That's where the concentration camps got started in Europe. Close the government part of medicine and give it to civilian doctors. If there's germs and diseases, take it out of Fort Dix, take it out of Georgia, take tax reductions of used aircraft into a medical institute run by a doorman or a chauffeur, with now 11 satellite hospitals being built. Take it out of Rockefeller medical hands and their tax deductions. If they want to give it to civilians to do work to find the causes of cancer or whatever, let them write it off. If I give money to a charity, $30 or $40 a year for medical write-offs or a charity, they can use it for what they want. I don't do my own testing and get a deduction for running it in my own house and running my own lab to see if my cat gets cancer, like David Ferrie was doing cancer experiments for the CIA and for himself down in New Orleans. Lee Harvey Oswald's cohort, who was very much involved in the assassination. Take the government and the tax deduction, give the deduction if they give it to a civilian medical person, and get the government tax write-offs out of the medical business. Close these institutes that are run by the government as tax deductions, and get the government out of Atlanta, Georgia, telling us what we have or don't have, and prosecute those people that are still doing the spraying and the testing. Very shortly, I'm going to do a tape or two just on medical problems going on in the news every week. I have one file, one big section dated with medical problems and cancers in this country. An example is an article, Unusual New Birth Defects Stump the Nation's Doctors. 6 babies ranging from Florida to Alaska were born with fatal birth defects. The doctors don't know the cause. 3 of the 6 mothers were exposed to pesticides during their pregnancies, and the 4th stayed at a campground that had been sprayed with a weed killer. I'm sure you're reading this in all of your newspapers about pregnancies where the baby comes out like hamburger and all kinds of defects. There was an article in the San Jose Mercury 2 weeks ago. Even slipping into a sweater is risky for a 4-year-old child. And this comes from Minneapolis. It's a picture of a child, the mother and father with a little boy named Jay, who they hold, and his bones break every time they touch him. And he has a disease called osteogenesis imperfecta. And this article says that there are 30,000 or more people in the United States that have this disease. He only weighs 19 pounds. He's several years old, and if you change his clothes, the bones twist and break. They literally have to carry him and hold him as if he's in cotton. He's 4 years old and has a good mind, but his body is completely brittle. Everything fractures, and they call it OI. I went on to read this article. There was something about the faces of the people in it and the baby that I kept on reading about this particular subject. 30,000 people suffering from this genesis imperfecta. Now, the thing that caught my eyes, I went on the article, was It said the disease is hereditary. A parent with OI has a 50-50 chance of passing it on, but it can also result from a gene mutation, which apparently was the case with Jay. His sister shows no sign of OI. Then the article went on, the basic defect is functional. Severe cases are marked by deforming fractures, dwarfism, premature deafness, teeth that crumble, excessive sweating, constant constipation. Also, the whites of the eyes are genetically blue. In the cases where it's less severe, this may not be as apparent to others. Now, you remember Dr. Mengele's and the boys from Brazil. If you saw the movie, you saw those powder blue eyes. I have reminded people in the past, some start taking the tape today, so I have to keep referring to the past, and I don't like to go too much into it for those who already have it, because you can order those tapes. Dr. Mengele's The Angel of Death at Auschwitz did experiments on twins. He did experiments on people, on eyes. He wanted to change colors, and the Liebers born were 30 or 40,000 children that are now 30 years old, or a little over 30 years old. They were out loose in society. They were adopted by the Gestapo and other people that were genetically either test tube babies or tested. They were raising baby farms to procreate Hitler's special kind of genetic children. The Nazis were very much into birth and genetic changes. And I'm wondering, out of these 30,000 people in the United States, when this disease first appeared, whether it ever appeared before World War II, or if this is the heritage of Mengele's, and if these people in Minneapolis, his family, the Mandevilles, have had any contact in Germany, the parents, if they were from Germany or any part of World War II, that they had a chance to be tested or inoculated or so forth with genetic changes, because this is the only article outside of Mengele's that I've read where eyes turn powder blue, and that's what he was working on, and that is what he was doing. Mengele's is still alive. There's been an effort to try to get him out of Paraguay, but there's a $50,000 reward. He's not about to come out. As I said before, the police in France and the police in Chile and the police in the United States and all over the world protect these Nazis. They're on the side of the Nazis. That's why they're the police chiefs. They've been put there to protect them. Mengele's isn't coming out. If any of you know any more about this disease or ever heard of it, there's a clinic in St. Paul, Minnesota, the Gillette Children's Hospital, where the co-director is working on this disease. See what you can find out about it, because this powder blue eyes and the symptoms here are the things that Mengele's was working on. The age group of the parents is right. The genetic mutation makes me concerned, and these matters will not ever end until we find out how many people they have experimented on and where they are when these disease surfaces, and how we're getting all of these deformed babies, sterile people working in factories, children with hair lips, every kind of spinal problem. It's appearing, surfacing now, and it's treacherous, and I'm spending a lot of time on this because this is the kind of seed that is sprouting from the past, the unsolved fruit of what took place before. Again, the Project Paperclip, the undiscovery of these people, letting them slip in. Are these people, the Mandevilles, just innocent victims of experimentations? Did this disease happen? I think we should know. We should know about those spraying clouds over Utah. If they spray them over Utah to cause mental derangement or dementia, they can do them over any state. And I'm sure there was no frame up in Utah that said you have to stay within this limit. There's no fence in the sky yet. The clouds had to move somewhere else. What was the time limit on them? How would they know it just stayed in Utah or didn't float all over the Midwest, just as the pneumonia vapors now are linked to Pontiac disease? I don't believe all that crap, and I think we should get into the study of the medicine in Germany and the study of the medicine in the United States and take it more seriously than we're doing if we expect to see a generation that has any health at all, if they're all going to be reduced to vegetables. And now on this tape, I want to give as much time as I can to another subject, my favorite subject, the update of the book Alternative 3. And again, those of you who don't have that information can look at the list of tapes and order whatever you want on it, because we don't have time to go backwards and keep you updated. We have to go forward on these matters. I'm sorry, but that's just the way the tape flows. I got a brochure. It's a section from a magazine called Self-Help, and I'm giving you the date here on the printed sheet so you can order it for yourself. It's put out of Scottsdale, Arizona, and it's by a group of young people who want to use seminars and information as a tool of transformation of your particular goals. This, again, is one of these, like an EST type of thing. We're into the generation of help yourself, and this is a self-help update. And in this little newspaper that came to me, again from another listener up in California, is an article by Francie and Brad Steiger called Starbirth. The Steigers wrote a book called Gods of Aquarius, put out by Harcourt, Brace, and Janovich in 1976. And this little article tells about how they worked into finding people, noticing that people traveling around the country 8 years ago, making acquaintances with men and women, nurses, psychologists, social workers, and medical doctors, that they were normal in appearance and integrated in their society, but they had some claim to ancestral heritage going back to the past, and their lifestyle suggested that they came from another space. And this author says, over the years, I came to recognize these. He called them star people. The Steigers call them star people. And it said the UFOologists, that's the title, like the research theorists, have commented that there's physical similarities between men and women who claim they've seen the UFO entities. And the star people have certain physical attributes and anomalies, which he had written in his book, The God of Aquarius. So this particular author, Brad Steiger, and his wife went to another person, James Beal, of Martin Marietta Aerospace. He describes he's a former NASA engineer. He participated in the Saturn V and works on the Space Shuttle program, and he was intrigued by the star people on that premise that they appeared similar to what we were seeing with UFOs. And you know how this goes back to my tapes on that subject. So they decided to check it out in the research laboratory, and Mr. Beal from NASA and the Space Shuttle program began to look into men and women who had this sense of mission, investigate people, social services, psychologists, and so forth, helping nurses and so forth, and to check the physical anomalies that were described as helpers in the original book, Gods of Aquarius. The author went to NASA, to Mr. Beal, and he began to check this out. And the NASA Space Shuttle program expert from Martin Marietta Aerospace said this was true, that star people seem to answer the question, and this is a quote from the article by Mr. Steiger, it helps answer the question of why this alleged genetically transmitted awareness is breaking forth as if implanted by some chromosome time-release mechanism. The people say they are remembering and being activated now so that they can serve their cousins during the approaching time of transition, in quotes, the great cleansing, end quotes, which they say the entire earthborn species must endure and survive in order to attain a higher state of consciousness and to effect personal and societal transformation. Now that's a long sentence. If you didn't get it, the value of these tapes is you play it over. The great cleansing, remember Auschwitz, where they went to the showers, they took off their clothes, and they had the great cleansing? The transition, this says that the entire earthborn species have to go to a higher state of consciousness, and that they will be guided by people who seem to be genetically transmitted, who have an awareness through some implanted chromosome, and they will help you make your transition to your cleansing. You're going to have a great cleansing and a transformation. That does fit in with Alternative 3, don't you believe? A teacher from the Bay Area sent me this article. He was even afraid to put his return address. He sends me other articles on the envelope, maybe for repercussions. Speaking of that, before I finish the tape, if any of you are having trouble with the Internal Revenue, I mentioned my mail was going, some of it to the Internal Revenue, let me know. 2 people who take the tapes have been harassed. One lady has been investigated by the IRS. Another family was being charged for money from back taxes. If you're having any trouble with the IRS, please let me know so we can know if any other people subscribing to these tapes are being hassled by the federal government. Is this coincidence or conspiracy? Our time is out again. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be with you next week. You take care, and let's hope the news is better every week. Is that too much to ask?